Welcome, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm so honored to welcome a really eminent guest, the great Professor Ross W. Duffin. He is the author of How Equal Temperament Ruined Harmony and Why You Should Care, 2006, Shakespeare's Songbook, and as well Choir Cleveland. He's really had a tremendous career, and I can't wait to talk to him about early music and so many different topics. So, Professor Duffin, welcome and good morning.
Good morning. Yes, it's early.
It's early. I really appreciate you, sir, taking the time to speak with me. It's really an honor, and maybe I should just mention that your name came up. People might know my show from my interest in partimento and hexachordal solfeggio and that 18th century sort of thing. But I remember the great Professor Giorgio Sanguinetti said, this is in passing on Facebook, you've got to read this book. This book is really interesting book, How Equal Temperament Ruined Harmony and Why You Should Care. And I figured, what? There's nothing, there's things other than equal temperament. And, coming from a very contemporary background that I had. And this book really had, it really is thought provoking because for someone who's very used to equal temperament, first of all, can it even be possible? And what would that sound like? And isn't that so much work? And is it worth the effort? And so you're a really good person to speak on that subject. So why don't we jump in right there? Because I think that's a really good topic. So for most people, most musicians in the 21st century, equal temperament is a standard. That's it. You turn on the radio and sure, some producer might change with a few cents here and there, but that's the standard. You expect that. So are there viable alternatives that are good and real? And what's the story there?
Well, I guess the first answer is that there were viable alternatives that were good and real and that worked perfectly well on the repertoires that they were designed for. And since in modern times we do a lot more music than they did in the past. I think in the past it was much more a sense of let's do the latest music, whatever the latest music is. But now, because we do so much historical music, it became a critical issue for me that there was just so much equal temperament. And I don't blame people for that. I think that, people are forced to work with the temperament that they find on their pianos or on their keyboard instruments. And really, for over 100 years, equal temperament has been the standard. And so people grow up listening to equal temperament. And for many people, that's what sounds right. And if it's not equal temperament, it sounds out of tune. I remember even 40 years ago, sending a tape out of something that was in quarter comma mean tone, early 17th century repertoire in quarter comma mean tone. And someone responded, that is the most out of tune playing I've ever heard. I don't know how you could have anything to do with these people. And of course, it was fantastic. It's just that it was and so I thought that there was a story there that needed to be told and that I wanted to direct at a large audience, not just the tuning aficionados, because there's a lot of tuning literature that is, down in the weeds and arcane and is going to put off a lot of people. So I wanted to make it compelling, but understandable and memorable. And so that's why, for example, I commissioned cartoons for the book, because it lightened the mood in a way, and it also imprinted certain concepts in a way that my prose could not. And so I think the book has been really successful. It's been translated into several languages, including Chinese, and has continued to sell copies this many years after it came out. So the basic message was that before equal temperament became a standard, there were other ways of tuning, and the other ways of tuning were more harmonically based for the most part, and that it was worth experimenting on keyboards, experimenting with the irregular temperaments that favored central keys over others. I mean, nowadays, you want to say, well, gee, C sharp major ought to be able to sound as good as C major. Well, they didn't think that way. I mean, they didn't use C sharp major very much because it didn't sound quite as good as C major did. So they concentrated the euphony, the better harmony, in the more central keys, and so that's what those keyboard temperaments were doing. But I guess the main thrust of my book was that non-keyboard instruments had their own system, and that is the story that I felt needed to be told most of all. There have been plenty of writings about keyboard temperaments over the years, and I did have some things to say about that, but I wanted to point out that non-keyboard instruments had a system where the intervals were certain sizes. Major third was a certain size, a little narrower than an equal temperament major third, and a minor third was a certain size, a little wider than an equal temperament major third, and that diatonic semitones were wider than chromatic semitones. I mean, that maybe is the biggest surprise for people in starting to work with this system. But anyway, so that's how the book got started, and what I was trying to do with it anyway.
Did you receive very strong reactions for the title of the book? Because that's quite a strong title, and it's obviously meant for a mass audience, so it needs to be a bit interesting. But what was the reaction like, the scholarly and the regular audience?
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing to say is that people often misread the title or have misinterpreted the title as how equal temperament ruined music and why you should care. And of course, that's not what I said. No, nothing like that. But it did affect the quality of the harmony, and that is a point that I was able to demonstrate, I think, and that people would come away with. But sure, I mean, partly it was a polemical title because I needed to get people's attention. For example, the publisher contacted me and said, the production department would like to make "And Why You Should Care" a subtitle. And I said, well, what does that mean? And they said, well, it means it would be officially part of the book, but it wouldn't be on the cover. And I said, no, that's not acceptable, because people aren't going to know what I'm talking about. And if they see a title, "How Equal Temperament Ruined Harmony," they're going to think, I don't know what that's about. But if it says "And Why You Should Care," that challenges them to pick up the book and see what the reason is. And of course, the reaction was swift and strongly negative in some cases. I got one review that said, "This is the most subversive book on a musical subject that I've ever read." I immediately wrote my editor and I said, "I want that on the back cover of the book." So no press is bad press, as they say.
Yeah.
So, and I think a lot of those early reviewers simply were not reading the book. They were just knee-jerk reacting to the title and defending equal temperament as best they could. Whereas, I think it's a pretty balanced approach. I hope so, anyway. And so, sure. But I think over the years, it's found its way. And some people have written to me that it is a book that changed their life. And that's something an author, really is moved to hear. To write a book about tuning and have people tell you that it changed their life is really something. So, yeah, that was.
Can I ask you a series of rather maybe basic questions, and maybe you can just answer them in if these are really simple questions. So, for instance, do singers naturally sing in equal temperament or just intonation? Or because I understand what you're saying about beats and major thirds. So if two human beings get together and sing a third, are they consciously going for a pure third, or are they maybe culturally trained to sing in an equal temperament?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of acculturation there. I don't think people would naturally sing in just intonation. This is something that um, acousticians in the 1930s, for example, were at pains to show that singers did not naturally sing in just intonation, which requires very narrow major thirds compared to equal tempered major thirds. Well, if they never heard a pure major third, didn't know what it sounded like, how are they going to say, oh yeah, that's the major third that we should sing? So I think that those studies were flawed in that way, that people learn tuning by the practice of what they learned growing up. I mean, I know organists who have always played on equal tempered organs, and there's a kind of a jangle that occurs with equal temperament. The harmonies just are not quite settled, and to me, it sounds like an unpleasant jangle, and to them, it's kind of a buzz that if it's not there, then the music doesn't sound right. It's just not right. And so, those people would sing equal tempered thirds because that's what sounds right to them. And I think it's true of any singers, is that they're going to sing what they're used to. And if singers are used to being accompanied by piano, then they're more likely to sing in equal temperament in that way. But unaccompanied singers in the past, I mean, I think that the evidence shows that they were singing in a more harmonic way.
If you nowadays everyone's obsessed with absolute pitch and perfect pitch, and it's a very, like, I know a lot of pianists, and there's this thing about where they sing in fixed do and then they have perfect pitch and then that's the whole thing. But if you had absolute pitch in in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and you had all these different temperaments and tunings, and so what would that mean? What would that be for somebody? Would they just attune to their village and get used to that in their childhood, or would they what's the how does that work then?
Well, in the Baroque era, for example, I think there were pitch standards that varied by town, and largely, I think the pitch standard would have been
But town.
whatever the cathedral organ had. And then all the instrument makers, the woodwind makers, flute makers, oboe makers, and whatnot, they would make their instruments to play at that pitch, and that became the pitch. And then for people who had developed some kind of absolute pitch, that would be the pitch that they thought of as being proper. And the pitch standards varied a lot over time and from place to place, anywhere from a full tone below modern A440 to a half step above, or even more. And within that range, that's where A would be. And if you grew up with the cathedral organ at that pitch, then that's what you would think was right. So it is possible that people developed absolute pitch, but the standard, I think, probably varied, and they would not have developed a sense of equal temperament as the correct tuning because they didn't have a chance to hear it. There are descriptions of it in the late 16th century and into the 17th century, but it's clear that it's kind of an experimental thing, and people are mostly choosing not to use it because it doesn't sound as good harmonically.
If you if the advantage of equal temperament is this changing of keys and playing in C sharp major and all of this, does it begs the question, how many keys were did they use a lot of keys in back then, or did they just use a couple of keys?
Back then is a big
How back then? Yeah.
In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, they would normally have no signature at all, or one flat, occasionally two flats. To find a sharp signature is very, very rare. So you're focusing on certain key areas that are more limited than the ones that we use today. Not to say that they didn't transpose as needed. The pitch was not fixed at that time. So if a vocal piece, choral piece, for example, started with a chant intonation, it's whatever pitch the cantor chose to begin the piece, and then everyone would go from there. So that's another reason that I think people did not develop or strive to develop absolute pitch, because it would have driven them crazy. That that their eyes would roll as soon as the cantor would start, and think, "Oh, that's not the pitch,"
Yeah.
you know. But there were reasons to transpose. Singers that couldn't reach the bottom notes in the score as it was written, or singers that couldn't reach the top notes, or they had men falsettists on the top part instead of boys, or there were reasons that you might want to transpose from the written pitch. So yeah, no pitch standard. And anyway.
So if they sang purer intervals, were they be more exacting then in their tuning of their singing? Were they very particular about being absolutely in tune?
I think so. Of course, I can't prove this, but
We'd need a time machine.
yeah, for sure. I think that because the interval sizes were so defined, that they would know that if they were singing a chromatic semitone, it had to be smaller than a diatonic semitone. And even when you get away from just intonation towards extended mean tone tunings, which is what I talk about in the book, I had one person tell me, well, I couldn't possibly do the tuning that you recommend because I can't divide the octave into 55 equal parts. And I said, well, but you don't ever have to do that. You just the third a little narrower and sing the minor third a little wider, and things like that. So yes, okay, theoretically it sounds complicated, but in practice I think it was not. And it was, at least extended mean tone is very predictable. And so the minor third is always that size. It doesn't matter what note it's from, but if you have a minor third, then it's going to be that size. And that's different from keyboard tunings, for example, which, because of their irregularity, you might have 6 different sizes of semitone. So if you're not the keyboard player, if you're an instrumentalist who's playing with the keyboard, or if you're a singer, you need to become familiar with that particular temperament to know where the notes are, because that can be a challenge. And if all of a sudden the keyboard player said, well, I decided to tune, a different Neidhart temperament for this concert, you could be tearing your hair out because all of a sudden the notes don't sound like where they were in the rehearsal. But in the system just for the non-keyboard instruments and voices, there was a consistency that I think was gratifying, and that led them to be consistent about their tuning and precise about it too.
I'm really demonstrating my ignorance here now. With the lute is a very old instrument. I play a little bit of guitar, so that's in equal temperament. So are the lutes, when they're fretted, these old lutes, are they in equal temperament, or are they in a different tuning? So when they're strumming and accompanying Renaissance singers or earlier, what tune do the singers have to follow the lute, or how does that work?
Yeah, the singers have to follow the lute. I mean, you're basically stuck with whatever the accompaniment do. I mean, guitar, I decided not to talk about fretted instruments in the book,
Right. Yeah.
because it was opening up, excuse me, a can of worms that I just didn't feel I could get into and cover in the same way. But happily, I have a former student who's written a book about mean tone fretting on instruments like the lute. So, that's been covered now. But yeah, there's some indication that some lutes and viols put their frets in equal temperament in some cases. And of course, the frets for most of those instruments were tied frets. So they were not fixed frets like the guitar set into the fingerboard. They were tied on as strands of gut that were tied on the neck of the instrument. So they could move them around. But the thing is that the instruments that do survive that have fixed frets, like citerns and orpharians and bandoras, and those that do survive, they have a kind of a mean tone fretting scheme. So if you look at the neck of the instrument, you can usually see that first fret is wide, the second fret is narrow, the third fret is wide again. It's wider than it should be. A guitar, it gets smaller and smaller, right? It starts out wide, and then gets a little smaller, and then a little smaller, and a little smaller, all the way down to the end of the keyboard. Well, that pattern is different on fixed fret instruments, historical instruments, where it's wide, narrow, wide. that sort of thing. Once you get a certain distance down the keyboard, the fretboard, then I think it matters less about the differences, because you can push and pull the notes into tune, just as you might change the tuning of a note on a guitar for expressive purposes. The other thing is that for guitar, I think there's great variability in how precisely the frets are set. I mean, you're stuck with whatever they are. But I think in my experience, and the experience of this former student of mine, David Delata, is that there are many guitars in which they're not set well. And, there's not much you can do about that except get a new fretboard. And then the other thing is that guitarists like to tune with harmonics. And I don't know whether you're among those or not, but if you tune with harmonics, then you're tuning basically in Pythagorean. So it's not even equal temperament, it's beyond equal temperament. Yeah, it just amazes me that guitarists can do this. It's because it's fairly flashy. It's a very flashy thing to do, to tune with harmonics, but it doesn't work well. When David Delata was first starting, he started out as a guitarist. When he was first starting lute, and I was recommending that he investigate tuning in mean tone, I don't think he would mind me telling the story because he's told it himself. He was dubious, and he said, well, what do I need to do? And I said, well, you need to set your frets according to these ratios. So he went off and came back and said, well, I did it exactly as you said, and it sounds horrible. Listen. And he played a chord. And I said, okay, so tell me what you did. So he did that. He told me how he'd set the frets, and I said, well, how did you tune the open strings? He said, well, I know how to tune open strings. I've been playing guitar for a really long time. And I said, well, you can't do that. You have to tune your open strings to the frets on the lower string below. And he looks at me sideways and goes off. And then he comes back 15 minutes later and he says, it's louder. It's just reinforcing itself. And so he began to tune in this way, which in fact reinforced the harmonics within the instrument, and as the player made it feel louder to him. So that's the reason for doing it. And yes, the fretted instruments, there is plenty of evidence that they did tune with these irregular tunings. Well, I say irregular, I mean, I recommend using regular mean tone tunings, for example, rather than trying to tune to an irregular keyboard temperament, which is always a challenge. I wrote an article about that more than 20 years ago. And I've had lute and theorbo players come up to me and thank me for that article. They say they send it to keyboard players when they continue want to explain to the keyboard player that they can't tune in Volati or Werkmeister 3 or whatever, because that's just not how frets work.
Right. What is your opinion about the electronic keyboard that with a press of a button, you can get your desired temperament? And perhaps you could even transpose in the same temperament, but in different keys. So you can have a sort of equal tempered mean tone.
Yeah. Well, it's a great convenience for one thing. And I know historical performers who use them, and particularly if they're touring, even just locally, it's a lot easier to move one of these little electronic keyboards than it is to move a harpsichord or an organ, and then have to retune when you get there, and then again before the concert and so on. It's funny because that article I was mentioning about irregular tunings was based on, I think it was the Yamaha keyboard, electronic keyboard, which was one of the early ones to offer different temperaments. And one of the temperaments was Volati/Young. And those two temperaments are constructed similarly, the same way, in fact, but they're transposed. They're around the circle. One is a fifth transposed from the other one. Well, the result of that is that all of the accidentals are in different places. So how can they call a temperament Volati/Young? Because they're not the same thing. They're constructed the same way, but they're not the same temperament. So that article that I wrote was called "Why I Hate Volati, or Is It Young?" And you can tell that I try to use provocative titles because it gets people's attention.
Mm.
Um, in that case, the reason was that people were using velati as a kind of early music equal temperament. It was a quote historical temperament, and then it was being used for everything. I went to a concert and it was being used for early 17th century Italian chamber music. And I thought, this is just completely wrong. I mean, the velati temperament was one that was put forward by Velati, who was a music master in Padua, I think. But it was just in manuscript, so it wasn't well known like some of the other temperaments, like Werkmeister and Neidhart and so on. It wasn't published until 1950. But it's really easy to tune, comparatively easy compared to other irregular temperaments. So that's why people were doing it. They were using it because the harpsichordists could tune it fairly easily, and then they were using an historical temperament. But it doesn't sound very good. So that was why I was complaining about that. It was because it had become a kind of early music equal temperament, and it was inappropriate both historically and musically. I guess the reason I got into this is because if you have a keyboard with temperaments that you can punch up, the problem is that you don't know exactly what they are. You know, they may say they're one thing, but they may not be exactly right, and that would be my concern, is that they're calling it something, but it isn't really right. So, I from an early date, I don't tune harpsichords any longer. I did when I was teaching and so on, and I got to be a big believer in actually tuning the instrument, counting beats and so on, which is how piano tuners have always done it. Although more recently, I think a lot of them just use an electronic tuner because they can be very precise. But if you're listening to beats, then you know that you're in tune. If you're listening to beats and counting the beats, then you know what you've got. And you're tuning the instrument as it is with the strings and the soundboard and the resonance, rather than just taking some kind of divorced electronic standard and deciding that that's what you're going to tune your instrument to.
Right. I want to turn the conversation to on the wider subject of early music. And I was listening to another interview that you did, and you were talking about that one thing that motivated you was to show that early music had the same level of sophistication as later music, because you said that perhaps some people would have criticized early music because it didn't have 13th chords or something like that, and you wanted to show that these were very intelligent people in the past. I'm on board with that immediately, because I mean, Aristotle, I'm there. So I know these people were smarter, maybe smarter. But so let's talk about this. I would like to talk about the perception of early music when you began your journey. Was it a little bit prejudiced like that against early music, or was it, what was it like essentially?
Yeah, I think there was a prejudice like that. I mean, there's always been the saying, people who can do and people who can't teach. And that was around the conservatory, and everyone was striving to be the player or a singer who made it, and so that you didn't wind up as a teacher. Which always, to me, meant that the conservatories were trying to teach all these people to be music stars, and they wound up as teachers, and they didn't know anything about teaching. But sure, when we first got to Case Western Reserve, where I taught for 40 years, the conservatory would send us, we had a joint program with the Cleveland Institute of Music, and they would send us singers, and they say, well, I think this person's voice is really an early music voice, which to them meant they don't think they're going to make it. But the vocal requirements of early music are not nearly what they are in later music. So yeah, they may have a chance in early music. So there was that perception among the faculty at the conservatory that it was lesser. And I think that there are statements by really eminent violinists like Itzhak Perlman and Pinchas Zukerman and so on, showing that they are very disdainful of the historical performance movement. I think both the instruments and the technique. And the developments over the next several decades, with the rise of virtuoso players in early music, meant that they couldn't make those claims anymore. That the music making was just at a fantastically high level, and that these players were choosing to do what they do, not because they couldn't make it in the mainstream performance world, but because that's what they wanted. You may know, I may, or maybe not, maybe some of your viewers know Andrew Manzi, who has made a lot of really wonderful recordings of violin music, Bach and Bieber and things like that. Well, I knew someone that knew him at Clare College, Cambridge, and they said he could play anything. He could play all of the major concertos. He would sit in his dorm room and play through all these concertos. You could hear him down the hall, and it was just fantastic. But he just got bored. It's that you just play the concerto, you play all the notes right, and it wasn't challenging for him. But then when he found early music and found that he had to not only play the notes, but he had to learn to improvise ornamentation in a certain way, and sometimes in a really flamboyant way, that he had the privilege and the responsibility of doing that, and he developed the skill and the imagination and so on. That was a lot more challenging for him, and so that's the direction he went. He went into playing Baroque violin because it was more challenging for him and more gratifying as a musician. And I think that's where early music has had a lot of success in, being 40 years at a university with a joint program with a conservatory. A lot of the students that came over to us to do early music, because the conservatory didn't try to do early music, they were happy for their students to come over, were the ones that really loved the freedom of early music in terms of improvisation, improvised ornamentation, and things like that. So that's where I think it's shown to be on a level with anything. That if you're going to be a successful early music performer, then you have to be able to improvise, and you have that freedom and you have that responsibility.
I have to say, I mean, I'm honestly more impressed by most of the harpsichordists that I talk to than the pianists that I talk to. I mean, because first of all, I mean, they can analyze this music very quickly and correctly, and the pianists don't know anything. Pianists basically, they don't know. They just read the notes, which is kind of scary. But I wanted to ask you. Oh, go ahead. Were you going to?
Well, I was going to say, I think the tradition in conservatories. I mean, conservatories does mean preserving an old tradition, right? You conserve, you save it from oblivion. The tradition has been the kind of mentorship, the kind of apprenticeship program where you learn to do it the way your teacher does it, and so you don't think about it. I know one case where one young student who was a pianist came and did a master class with Mitzi Meyerson, who's a fantastic harpsichordist, American harpsichordist, has been in Berlin for the last 30 years. And she was a piano prodigy herself. She played a concerto with the Chicago Symphony when she was about 12. So she was a good person to do this, and she, got this one young pianist to play in a certain way that he was really excited about. He went back and played it for his teacher, and she said, "Why are you doing that?" And he said, "Well, it's because I had this master class, and I really like it this way." And she said, "You're not old enough and not smart enough to have your own opinion about it. You have to do it the way I want you to do it."
Oh.
And that can be pretty limiting for someone who has imagination. So anyway, that I think has been the tradition. She was elderly, and that was the tradition that she grew up in. Therefore, the fact that a student would challenge her distinguished opinion about how a piece should be played was annoying to her. But that was a conservatory tradition. So it's I once mused about whether it was possible to teach early music in the same way. I mean, can you by just having people copy what you do, and my idea was always that no, the players, the singers, they need to go read the treatises for themselves, and work with a great teacher, sure, but they need to know what they're doing, and have an intellectual basis for what they're doing, in addition to the you know the physical basis of their lessons. So
Hmm.
anyway.
So I wanted to ask you one thing that I found, well, in many undergraduate music history courses, there's often a clear demarcation. This was the Renaissance. Okay, that's over. Then it's the Baroque. Okay, that's over. And then the Romantic Age. Okay, that's over. And there's these pockets of history that seem, and I go into the world after graduating thinking, okay, that's a Renaissance person, nothing to do with me. That's a Baroque person, nothing to do with me. But I was kind of really, in a way, blown away because I was reading up about the 18th century and they were singing Gregorian chant well into their conservatories. They might have been probably singing Palestrina because he was a very respected composer into the 18th, 19th century. So a lot of these traditions, singing hexachordal solfeggio. Now we talk about movable do and fixed do. What is this hexachordal solfeggio? So they were doing that even up to the 19th century. So Professor Duffin wanted to ask you, what can you speak on that, this idea that perhaps the different ages are not so completely alien from each other?
Yeah, I think we tend to forget that Gregorian chant is something that started a millennium ago, and was sung really daily in some places for hundreds and hundreds of years, well beyond the Middle Ages, which is what we think of as Gregorian chant. I had the experience of being asked to coach the choral scholars at St. John's College, Cambridge, in just intonation, and then I got invited to conduct Evensong, which was an amazing privilege to me, and it's just an incredible experience of a lifetime, to have all these fantastic young singers and in a wonderful space and singing Renaissance music in just intonation. And I had the day before, I had a workshop with them for about an hour, and then the day of the Evensong, I had about 45 minutes to get them all up to speed, and not all of them had been at the workshop, so that was a real challenge. And one of the pieces they were doing was alternatum, where it had chant and then alternating with polyphony. And the young man who was going to be doing the chant, he said to me, "Well, should I be doing just intervals in the chant as well? I mean, like a narrow major third and a wide minor third?" And I said, "Gosh, I'm not sure. I mean, I've always thought of chant as having been sung in Pythagorean, because that's the tuning that was prevalent in the Middle Ages, but I think you should just do what's comfortable for you in this context." And in the end, he decided that he was going to use just intonation intervals in the chant. And I realized, as I'm sitting there listening to him do it, that was the right decision, that those were the interval sizes for singers at the time that the polyphony was written. So there's no way that a singer would say, "Well, I'm singing chant, therefore I'm going to sing Pythagorean." They would sing narrow major thirds and wide minor thirds and so on. So I think that eras modified chant and chant performance to suit the context of what they had, and that was a changing situation throughout history. It's easier in a way to talk about centuries, because then you do have definite markers rather than talk about eras. I do a lot of work also with lyric poetry and music in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. And I've used the term Renaissance because that's an easy term. But nowadays in literature circles, they don't talk about Renaissance so much. They say early modern, which just means that, oh, yeah, it's sort of like the modern era, but it's the early part of the modern era. So there are terms that are coming to replace things like Renaissance. But and it's true that those things were different in different countries. I mean, I was one time, this was years ago now, but I was at a conference and someone said, "Well, are you a member of the 17th Century Music Society?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm not." And they said, "Well, why not? You do a lot of work in the 17th century." And I said, "Well, yes, it's true, but the work in 17th century I do is with English music. And it always seemed to me that 17th Century Music Society has a lot of Italian and German and French, but not so much English. And so I wasn't sure there was a place for me." And instead of saying, "Oh, no, yeah, absolutely, you should come," the response was, Yeah, you're probably right. So, so it's like the English, even though it was the 17th century, they weren't really in the 17th century. Um, the Renaissance went on longer in England than it did elsewhere. But there are always these kinds of overlaps, and that's why it's almost easier to refer to time periods, the actual, you know, demarcated time periods than it
You
is to.
mentioned you mentioned English, so I wanted to ask you, I put in my notes, can you say something about Thomas Tallis and William Byrd and what they
Oh,
mean to you? Who they yeah,
oh,
those
right.
two composers.
Yeah, well, they're the two most important English composers of the 16th century. And Tallis was a mentor of Byrd, godfather to his child, Thomas. They were both at the Chapel Royal in England, and Tallis wrote a lot of wonderful music, and Byrd wrote a lot of wonderful music. We just celebrated the 400th anniversary of Byrd's death on July 4th last year. And so they really were huge in the history of English music. Yeah, that's Byrd, and an 18th century engraving. We don't know what Byrd looks like, but that tends to get used because there is nothing else. Um, and really wonderful, a wonderful polyphony and gorgeous harmonies and cross relations. There's Tallis. Yeah.
um, what made you choose to work on English musicians and composers? What was the draw for you?
Right. Well, you mentioned Shakespeare's Songbook, and that was,
Yes, yes.
my first sort of really big um, work in English music. I have it. Oh, you probably could pull it up on
Yeah,
Amazon,
I'm
but
pulling it up now. Yeah.
there it is there.
Yeah.
Um, so I grew up 40 miles from the Stratford Shakespeare Festival in Ontario, Canada. And my mother was an avid Shakespeare fan, and she used to take my sister and me to everything that they put on in those years. So I think I had probably seen every play by Shakespeare by the time I was about 17.
Wow.
Um, and I was always curious about the music that was used. And as I began as an undergraduate interested in early music, I thought, well, why aren't they ever using any early music in Shakespeare's plays? And ironically, when I was in college, another student there, he was doing a master's while I was an undergraduate, was Berthold Collier, who was the music director at Stratford Festival for decades. And the music that they used was his music because there was so little or none of the music that survives from Shakespeare's day for the plays that every Shakespeare company needed to have a composer as a music director because they needed to be able to generate these pieces of music that were needed, whether they were song settings or incidental music. So I started to think about that, and then in the early '90s, I saw a reference, a line from a play that said, "What's the news, Rogero?" This is from Winter's Tale. "What's the news, Rogero?" And I thought that's really funny because Rogero is the name of a ballad tune, and why would Shakespeare use that as a name? He doesn't use it anywhere else. And then I discovered that there was a ballad to the tune of Rogero that had a plot that kind of paralleled the Winter's Tale. And I thought that
Oh.
is really amazing. There's kind of a layer of meaning there that Shakespeare's audience would have got that we don't get because we don't know that repertoire.
Right.
And so that started me on that path to find all these songs that Shakespeare was just alluding to in that way or quoting sometimes a line from a ballad. There's a place in Twelfth Night where Sir Toby sings, "Oh, the 12th day of December." Well, it's just a line in the play. And a lot of people didn't realize it's actually a line from a song. It's the beginning of a very, very long song about a battle. And Toby has that line at the point where he's already been making a lot of noise, and Mariah comes out, tells him to be quiet. And after she tells him to be quiet, he sings, "On the 12th day of December." Well, everybody in the audience would have known that that he's beginning a very, very long battle song, and he's not going to be quiet. And so it was that meaning that was lost to modern audiences. And so that's what I was trying to uncover. In the process of that, I realized that some of these Shakespeare songs had rhyming words and keywords that were the same as some of this popular song repertory. And from that, I concluded that Shakespeare was actually not writing his song lyrics to be set by a composer. He was writing them to songs that he already knew, and that the musical settings of the songs were already there, were among the popular song repertory. And so I was able to set all of Shakespeare's set songs, about 36 set songs that are in the first folio in italic type and labeled the song and so on, to popular music from the time. So that was that, and that has led me to do other plays.
Wait a sec. Well, let me jump in, Professor Duffin. So, I mean, this is one of the most studied authors celebrated in history. Were there? I mean, what you did was pretty significant. I mean, they were really deep, getting more meaning out of a really celebrated canon of literature.
Yeah.
Did any Shakespeare scholars reach out to you and say, "Oh my goodness, this is huge"? I can't.
Yeah.
That's a big that's a big thing.
Yeah, it's been very gratifying. I know that, for example, at RADA, the Royal Academy of Drama, training for actors in the UK. I mean, it's the place, one of the places to go. That they basically use it every day. As a kind of a discipline to take a song and sing from it. So I know that it has had an impact. But the thing was that I also knew that what I was doing was really unusual, that no one had ever done anything like this before. And so after I had spent a period of fellowship at the Folger Library, I decided, well, I should really see if there's going to be any interest in this. And I decided I would approach W.W. Norton, because they were the biggest music publisher and Shakespeare publisher in the world. And I wrote, and I didn't hear anything back. I mean, I don't think that they accept sort of unsolicited stuff, and they didn't know who I was. And so I thought, okay, well, that's fine. I'll write the book, I'll draft the book, and then try again. And so I did. And about 2-3 years later, I wrote again. I still didn't hear anything. So I contacted Barbara Mowat, who was head of the Folger Institute, and who I got to know at the Folger Library. And I said, I know you know the editor at Norton. Could you write and say that I'm not a kook? And the next day, that day, I had an invitation to send the book manuscript. So I did. And then when it arrived and they looked at it, I was told afterwards that the music editor, the Shakespeare editor, and the poetry editor were dancing around the editorial office, because they realized immediately that after 400 years, there was something new to be said about
That
music.
is huge. I mean, that is incredible. Wow.
So
Wow.
I've continued to do that. I have published a book in 2018 on songs in English comedy, and I've done work on Shakespeare's sonnets, which for the most part do not survive with early musical settings. And then more recently, poems of John Donne and Philip Sidney. So yeah, I mean, I feel very attached to poetry from that era, and particularly lyric poetry that was intended to be sung or could be sung. And I've developed my own databases and so on. So, but sometimes it's not even necessary. I remember going to hear talk about John Marston, a playwright, and the scholar was putting up one poem after another, and I was thinking to myself, well, I know what tune that one was sung to. I know what tune that one was sung to. So yes, I've got databases, but I've also now got a lot of experience with lyrics and have a good idea of what music could have been used. It probably was used for some of these things.
I noticed some solfeggio syllables in some of Shakespeare's. I don't remember the play. You probably would know, but I think he was mentioned in one of the plays. He was just there was some solfeggio. I mean, some of the Guidonian syllables were there, and I wanted to bring you to the topic of just hexachordal solfeggio in general. You have a terrific show. We talk about the micro. Guido used the name of his treatise as the name of your show. Can you speak
Right.
a little bit about Guido d'Arezzo and is that important solfeggio? I think a lot of people are curious. I think a lot of people now in general are very curious about pedagogy from how they did it back then because it's
Right.
just really they thought really well and people are really catching on to it now. But what's the deal with the solfeggio and Guido and that whole history? I mean, it's over 1,000 years now.
hmm Well, the solmization system, the hexachordal system that was in use for most of the Middle Ages and through much of the Renaissance, um, was based on just six syllables of the system: ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, and they derived it from the Gregorian hymn to St. John the Baptist that started on successively higher steps of the scale up to la, and it could be transposed. It could start on C, it could start on G, or it could start on F, so long as there was a flat. So the note at B could either be B natural or B flat, and they called that B fa B mi. So B fa would be B flat, and B mi would be B natural. B fa would be fa in the F hexachord, and B mi would be mi in the G hexachord. So with that system, overlapping hexachords, they could psalmize any piece of music. A singer being trained in this might have started to learn a piece by psalmizing singing the psalmization syllables. And there are some prints of metrical psalms in the 16th century in England that actually have psalmization syllables written against the notes, so that it's meant to help people, learn the tunes. In England, it starts to break down, and they start to basically just use fa sol la, which is why those kinds of syllables are the ones that get mentioned when they get used in plays. It's um, limited number of syllables. Mi fa sol la has to be a semitone in there somewhere. But you'll find it in treatises um, in the late 16th century in England. Morley mentions it. Thomas Ravenscroft, I edited Thomas Ravenscroft's treatises, and he talks about the hexachordal system. John Dowland, the one of the greatest lutenists of all time, the lutenist and lutenist song composer, he translated a 16th century treatise called Micrologus that was published in 1516, 1517, something like that. And he translated it in 1609. So he was interested in it even that late. And it was, I think, for the most part, it was outside of most people's interest, and certainly outside of the interest of practical musicians by that time. But it's significant to me that Dowland was sufficiently interested in it that he would go to the trouble of translating this treatise that was 100 years old.
Great.
Um,
Great. No,
yeah.
no, because I had another question on performance practice, and you are a very experienced leader of groups, of early music groups. What do you have to say about rhetoric, the idea of rhetoric? I've heard that that's important in performance practice. It's something that we don't really think about in the modern age. Everything is quite metronomic now. But is that an important thing for early music performance?
Well, sure. I mean, there are descriptions of um, madrigal performances, for example. I think it may be in Frescobaldi's one of Frescobaldi's collections, where he says that you should play these toccatas just like you were singing a madrigal, where you get soft and slow, and you speed up and do all those kinds of things, changes of tempo according to what's going on in the text. So we know that they were sensitive to the text when they were performing this music. So it might look like it's all in one meter and then sung the same from start to finish, but really you should be paying attention to what the text is doing, and therefore modifying your dynamics and your tempo according to the expression of the text. And Frescobaldi's making the parallel that his toccatas were also rhetorical in the same way, that there are these different sections, and you should vary what you're doing. So, sure, I mean, that's pretty early, 1615, I think. So I think that they were certainly aware of those things from an early date. In the Baroque era, it becomes even more important, and there's the idea of affect, where a piece or a section of a piece has a certain emotional character, and you should modify your performance in order to enhance and bring out the affect, the emotional character of these individual sections.
One thing you are known for is your expertise on historical Latin pronunciation. And why is that important? And how does that affect the overall performance?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is that people pronounced Latin in those days as if it were their own vernacular. It wasn't until the 20th century that the Pope decreed that people should be pronouncing Latin according to the Italian way, and that was the only way you could do it. And of course, once the Pope says that, then that's what Catholics were required to do. But in centuries past, they simply pronounced Latin as if it were their own vernacular language. There's a story, I think, of the Emperor Maximilian, and a delegation comes to him from, I think it was France, and they have some speech or other, and he turns to his advisor and says, "What language are they speaking?" and they says, "Latin, sir." Well, he didn't even hear it as Latin because it sounded incomprehensible. And
Maximilian the First?
Yeah.
Okay.
So people pronounce Latin as if it were their own vernacular, but I think that also composers set Latin in that way too. So, for example, there's a piece by, I think it's Pierre de la Rue, who is a French-speaking composer serving the Habsburg court in what's now Belgium, Mechelen and Brussels and so on. And he has a motet that says, "Ave Mater Miserorum." That's what we would say, "Ave Mater Miserorum." And it's set rhythmically as "Ave Mater Miserorum." So that is what he would say as a francophone, and that's the way the piece is set. And so you would have musicologists saying, he was terrible at setting Latin, or he had no concept of word rhythm. Well, of course he had concept of word rhythm. It's just that the concept of word rhythm he had was as a French speaker speaking the language, so that the accent was on the final syllable, and so that has an effect. And I think a lot of those pieces work better if you use in that case, French Latin pronunciation in order to show what it was that Pierre de la Rue was trying to achieve with his music.
Fantastic. So, wow, that hour really flew by. So, I just have two more quick things. The first thing is I have to bring up "O Canada," which was really I have to. I'm sorry, Professor Duffin. You're probably sick of talking about it, but it was a very interesting. I mean, you really found some musicological background to the song. Really important song on the world stage. And you wrote that it was perhaps a composite of several pieces. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Canada, so "O Canada" was something that was in my bones. And I was aware that people had often said that the opening was taken from the March of the Priests from Mozart's Magic Flute. That was something that I'd always been aware of. And then in the early 2000s, I heard a paper by someone on Wagner, and they played Wach auf, which is a chorus from Die Meistersinger, and there was this passage that was directly out of "O Canada," except of course it was the other way around. "O Canada" was using this passage from Wagner, and I went up to him afterwards. I said, "Anyone mentioned this? Because any Canadian would have heard it immediately." And he said, "No, I had never thought about it." And So that was one more thing. And then um, in I think 2014, as the director of Choir Cleveland, I programmed this piece. It was called the Hymn of Peace, and it was written for the 1869 um, Peace Festival celebrating the end of the Civil War. It was a bit late for that, but and it was based on a piece that had been written earlier in 1866 or 67 by a German immigrant composer. And the whole second half of the piece was the second half of O Canada. And this obscure piece, and yet this is what was going on. Well, I was able to document that Lavallee, the composer of O Canada, was in Boston at the time of the Peace Festival, and undoubtedly heard this piece, which was the centerpiece of the festival. It was commissioned for it, and he was involved as a conductor and as a performer. Um, and then there was just the one passage in the middle of the triad, stated and then stated a step higher, and I had no idea what that was. And then I was reading something, and it had this passage from Liszt, a festival overture by Liszt, and there was this motion, and it was exactly the right time period. And I realized then I had the entire piece, and it was a pastiche. And the Lavallee had put the whole thing together as a pastiche, and so I wrote it up as an article, and I tried to be as positive as I could about it. I mean, for one thing, they weren't talking about stealing, and they were, it was an homage in a way to use somebody's music, and I pointed out that in fact putting the anthem together like that was a kind of a representation of Canada as a mixing pot of nations. The U.S. talks about the melting pot, but in Canada it's a mixing pot where they don't try to, have people blend in so much as just gather together with their own distinct identities, and that learning this about O Canada was great news for all the Canadians who were not either English Canadian or French Canadian, the two great traditions. But the day the article came out, actually, there was it came out, and then immediately afterwards, I was contacted by a reporter for the Toronto Globe and Mail, and they did an article about it. And I said, "Please, please, please, do not say in the headline that O Canada was stolen." So he was really annoyed, but managed to at least avoid that language. But I got hate.
I was about to ask you about the
Yeah.
reaction.
Yeah, I got hate mail, and people don't want to believe it. But it's pretty clear if you read my article that that this is what Lavallee did. Interesting story that the person who gave it to the Governor General told the story afterwards that he saw that Lavallee had neglected to sign the score. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting thing that no one has ever really mentioned before. But I wondered whether Lavallee, having put this thing together, felt like, what's really his, or he just didn't feel like he could sign the score. I'm not sure. That was just speculation. But it is curious that he didn't sign the score that was presented to the Governor General. Anyway, that's that story.
You are uncovering, if it's not Shakespeare, it's always on a big scale, something big. If humanity puts you on to figure out something, you're gonna come up with the answer. So, and the final question would be, I mean, you know so much about early music, but let's say this is a fun question. If I gave you a time machine, and do you have a burning question that I wish I could just know the answer to this, and it would be so convenient if I could just go back in time and get the answer. First of all, do you have a burning question for early music in terms of performance practice or whatever? What would you like an answer for any question? Do you have such a thing?
Sure, but not just one. There are so many, that things that are mysteries. Yeah, it's impossible to say. I mean, when I was a graduate student, I was really into Guillaume Dufay, and I was really depressed that his Requiem had not survived. Yeah, says I need to find Dufay's Requiem. I need to hear what this piece was. But over the years, there have been so many things having to do with music and Shakespeare and so on, that it's hard to just name one thing. There are just so many mysteries. There was a musicologist at Harvard named John Ward, and he did a lot of wonderful work on early lute music and early English music in general. And I got to know him a little bit in the early 2000s. He was already retired by that time, and he read my Shakespeare songbook in draft and had comments on it. And he wanted to give me copies of several of his articles, off prints of his articles. And he wrote on one of them, "To my fellow tune detective, Ross Duffin." And so I've sort of worn that epithet, pride. Yeah, I like the mystery of finding things out, of knowing that something was sung, for example, but for which the original music is lost, and trying to figure out what it was or what it could have been.
Great. Well, the great Professor Ross W. Duffin. I mean, really, what an enlightening episode, and just having a great conversation and learning so much. Sir, thank you so much for being so gracious with your time, and I hope you'll come on again because there's so much we could talk about. But it was really a pleasure, and I hope to speak with you again soon.
Thanks for inviting me. It was fun.